thank you for coming out. I'm sure there'll probably be some more filter in. Thank you for everyone for being here, and thank you for everyone who's in orange today. When we bought the shirts here at Georgian, they sold out within like 2 days, which was really amazing. I guess we know now for next year we'll have to like double the order. But I want to get started before we're too far behind today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kayla McCormick, and I'm the Indigenization Specialist here. And I'm going to invite a student who's actually from the Aurelia campus, but happens to be here today, Montana, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good morning. So, like she said, my name is Montana. I go to the Aurelia campus, and I'm here to introduce Riley. So, Riley is an Anishinaabe woman from Yabetong First Nation. From 2017 to 2019, Riley acted as a member of the Prime Minister's Youth Council, where she provided advice to the Prime Minister and members of the federal government, among others. She has worked with Indigenous leaders across the country as a First Nations Self-Determination Advisory Board, and has spent the past 2 summers working with Anishinaabe Aski Nation under the Executive Council. Riley has participated in more than 100 panels, workshops, and conferences, including a Young Women's panel at the UN Conference of Climate Change, on Climate Change's 24th Conference of the Parties in Katowice, Poland, the Institute on Governance Nation-to-Nation Dialogue Series, and the Rotary Club's International Conference. She has given a keynote address in Stockholm, Sweden, and the World Forum on Gender Equality, and has delivered a TED Talk on Canadian identity. Riley is a part-time writer and has contributed to major Canadian media outlets, including Maclean's and the Toronto Star, where she primarily covers youth and Indigenous issues. Please welcome Riley Yesno. Whew, that was a lot. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Ani, Bojo, Wache, Tanse, Kwe, Shego. I'm hoping I'm getting everybody in the room that we could possibly do. It's so nice to be here today. I'm really excited that I get to be here in a room with everybody in their orange shirts on the anniversary of IRS celebration. One sec. So I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. And before I begin with the land acknowledgement, I think it's important to have a conversation about them, because land acknowledgements are so often the thing that, you slap at the beginning of the presentation to get through to the actual presentation. And that is a really problematic way, I think, to approach land acknowledgements. And there's also a conversation to be had about Indigenous people being the ones to acknowledge the land. Especially, I'm also Anishinaabe, so this is around the territory where my relatives would be. And I think that land acknowledgements have a way of being very meaningful if done correctly. And so I not only acknowledge that I'm a visitor on this territory, the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, but it's also important to recognize treaty and which treaty we're on, because there are certain responsibilities that each of us have under said treaty. And Barry's an iffy one, and I was wondering if somebody was gonna maybe call me out on this, because I know that Barry actually straddles 2 of the treaties in Ontario. And so I'm pretty, like 80% positive that it is the Lake Simcoe Treaty, but if somebody knows better than I please correct me. But I think also something that's missing from a lot of land acknowledgements is acknowledging the water, the land, the air, the creatures, the plants, all of the beings that share this land with us too, that it never only belonged to the Anishinaabe, that it always belonged to all of us, and to all living beings here, and also the spirits that have been here and the ones to come. And those are important things, I think, that often get missing. And then making a promise on, I acknowledge this, and what am I gonna do about it then? And so my promise is to work and play here in a respectful way, to put the teachings that I have into practice, and to make sure that I am doing my work in a good way, in the best way that I can, to honor those relationships that I'm acknowledging. And so that is a land acknowledgement. Hopefully maybe give some people things to think about going forward when we hear them all over the place, You'll notice the good ones and the bad ones very quickly based on that. So, Ani, Hanin, Pojo, Wache, Tanze, Shego, Kwe. My name is Riley Yesno. Riley Yesno, Nintijanakaz, Yamatang First Nation, Ekwa Thunder Bay, Nintoche, Niminweya. My name's Riley Yesno. As was mentioned, I'm from Yamatang First Nation in Northern Ontario in Treaty 9 territory. And if anybody knows where Thunder Bay is, Yamatang is about 400 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, so we're getting near the tree line up there. It is a community of about 1,500. It's a fly-in, and I went to school there. Then there was no educational opportunities for us on the reserve, and so my mom moved all of us down to Thunder Bay so that we could go to school all together. And I've been living in Toronto for 3 years now, and going to U of T. I'm at the St. George campus. And the reason why I tell you all of this about me as well before we get into the presentation is it's something you'll notice, I think, also that a lot of Indigenous folks do is this introduction, telling them about where they come from, where their family comes from, all of these things. And it's not something I often see that non-Indigenous presenters do. And I think that's also a bit of a problem because what I'm saying is, yes, I'm introducing myself to you, and I'm starting to build this relationship with the people in the audience, but also I'm holding myself accountable. I'm letting you know where I come from, where my knowledge comes from, where my biases might lie, who I'm responsible for when I'm speaking. And that's something that I think is really important and is really important, especially in a university setting where we so often forget to check biases, where we look at speakers and the people that come on stage as the kind of, sovereign knowledge holders about said topic. And don't recognize, A, the people that got those people there, and B, where those faults might lie. And this is a very lovely picture of Nanabiju in Thunder Bay, the sleeping giant. So you can see him hanging out over there on the water. And Thunder Bay is truly, truly stunning. If anybody ever has a chance to go up there just to be there on the land, I highly, highly recommend it. It's a really, no bias at all, one of the beautiful places in the country. So, moving along, this was the quote that I was asked to come and kind of speak here about today. It's a very famous one. Have anybody heard it before, I'm assuming? Yeah? Education got us into this mess, and education will get us out of this mess. Senator Murray Sinclair said this after the TRC release in 2015 to CBC. A funny anecdote, Marie Wilson, who was also one of the commissioners on the TRC, claims that she actually said this first, but Murray got to the CBC first, and so this has been a long-standing thing between her and I. But in either case, both brilliant people and a stunning quote. And I think there's a lot to unpack out of this one. And so the first thing that I want to do is kind of get like a base level of knowledge. I'm assuming based on the people in this room and the conversations I've had that everyone kind of has a pretty solid foundational knowledge about the history of Canada, the real history of Canada, about Indian residential schools. Can anybody tell me before we watch a short video on it? Because I think it's important, the video that I'm about to show you is told by a survivor. And I think that's the important way to have people learn about it and to get that knowledge and understanding. But before I show that, can anybody tell me when the last residential school closed in Canada? Yeah. 1996, yeah. So it's important when we're watching this video to keep that in the back of mind. It's something I think about often. I also have friends from the Northwest Territories and from Nunavut who claim that also the last residential school there closed actually in 1998, but it just wasn't a federally run or funded residential school, so it's why Canada doesn't count it under that. But yeah, so we're looking really, really not too long ago when we're talking about this. And so this is a video that the CBC put together around residential schools in 2017. So.
I was 6 years old when they took me to a residential school. I remember the day walking toward that school with my mother, and it was a silent walk, and I was so afraid. 20 or 30 little kids herded into the showers, and then your body being painted in white liquid of some kind, your hair cropped and then doused in kerosene. And that was pretty traumatizing. The school held roughly 220 people, half boys, half girls, and we were segregated. If I was caught waving at my sister, there'd be a punishment for it. And so as a result of that segregation, I never really learned any social skills that young people should be learning as they grow up. From a religious and spiritual perspective, of course, the churches lobbied hard to convert Indigenous people, Aboriginal people. They said that we were heathen and pagan, they targeted language in those things we had learned through all of millennia to know where we came from, to know who we were, as something that had to be eliminated. Before that time, I lived in a place called Guayasams. They call it Guilford Island now. We harvested from the forest all of the animals that we needed to provide as sustenance, and from the ocean in front of us as well, all of the species of whales and mink and fish. And I had a connection to the environment around us. And so, after having spent years in those schools, by the time we were ready to leave, most of us were pretty broken. Many of us, including myself, descended into addictions, alcoholism, violence, and it was pretty difficult. Those schools lasted for over 100 years. There were over 150,000 little children. And the last school that closed in Canada was in 1996 in Saskatchewan. There was a history on this land that had been absolutely ignored. Nobody knew about the residential school legacy. Nobody knew about the intent of the Indian Act, the chronic challenges now facing Aboriginals. And we're starting to accept the idea that we have the shared history for which we all are responsible for. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was submitted, I was in the room when Justice Murray Sinter, the chair of the commission, denounced Canada. He had just recited a litany of intensive harms against Aboriginal people. And when he said, Canada, you have committed cultural genocide, there was just a silence in that room, and then all of a sudden it erupted in euphoria. We said, survivors want an apology from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. And I was there and I heard the words, I'm sorry. And then I couldn't see because my eyes were just flowing with tears. I was so happy that somebody had said, I'm sorry. Canada, by the way, is the only Western country that has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're trying to look through a new lens. We and Canadians, we as an Aboriginal, we celebrate each other, everybody cheering each other up as we move toward a more equal, prosperous future for all of us. My name is Chief Robert Joseph, and I believe that Truth and Reconciliation is Canada.
So I apologize in advance. I'm realizing now I should have maybe at the beginning of this mentioned that this is or some sort of content warning. I find it still hard to watch videos like this all the time and hear the stories of survivors. And so I apologize for that. But I want to know how many people would have said that they knew about everything in that video that took place, or the things about the commission, what was going down in residential schools, how long they lasted for, or who knew a bulk of that, at least. Yeah. Oh, wow. See, that makes me feel really good because in 2017, when this first video came out, I was in Thunder Bay, which has one of the highest in urban Indigenous populations in the country, if not the highest, other than maybe Winnipeg or Saskatoon, 30% of the population. And where also 2 residential schools were located, and not one kid could tell me about any of that. Said it was totally mind-blowing and shocking to them, and that was in 2017. And so the leaps and bounds that we've come in only a short period of time, I think, are something to be noted, especially today, when we're thinking about these things and really grappling with and looking at all of the hard truths of the history and the present of this country. For myself, I didn't realize anything about residential schools. I didn't come into any sort of learning until I was about 16 years old. And I'm not that old, okay? But my grandparents were both residential school survivors. And growing up in the community that I did, I would say most everybody over the age of about 35 would have been either a residential school or day school survivor. My generation, I believe, is actually the first generation, and that of a lot of us in this room, that will certifiably have never been to a residential school. We are only one generation into this healing from the residential school system. And I think that's something really important to keep in mind, because even in that one generation, we've come to this place. And so there's a lot that is really somber and kind of humbling about all of that knowledge, and something that I think is really hopeful as well to keep in mind. And when I was working around the TRC at the time that it was happening, the survivors said one thing to me that I think about often, and it's, I said to my friend Max, and they said, you know, our greatest hope for you, as well as you recognize the atrocities and how horrible this situation was for us and is and continues to be for Indigenous people in this country, but that you can be less angry than we are. And so that is something also I think about today on Residential School Day. And so back to the quote of, education got us into this mess, and education will get us out. So when he says this quote, education, we're thinking about the residential school system, right? And then the next question is, what is the mess? What is the mess of Canada, the state of Indigenous affairs? And it touches everything, right? So this picture, this is from Maclean's, and the source is from StatsCan. It's talking about the foster care system, the child welfare system in this country. And if you look, this is the percentage of Indigenous children in the foster care system in each province. In Manitoba, 87% of children in the foster care system are Indigenous, 100% in Nunavut, 95% in the Northwest Territories. There are more children in foster care right now, Indigenous children, than there were at the height of the residential school era. And so this is one thing we're looking at. Another, we look at the prison industrial complex and the prison system. 4% of the population in Canada being Indigenous, 23% of the entire federal incarcerated prison population is Indigenous. And then if you look at the statistics of women in serving federal and provincial prison sentences, it's astounding, 36% and 41% respectively. We look at child poverty rates. Canada actually, in general, has one of the highest child poverty rates in the entire world, especially for the amount of wealth that we have as a country. I think 12% of all children in the country live in poverty generally. But if you then look at Indigenous demographics of this country, you're looking at, again, 55% compared to 16% in Saskatchewan, 34% compared to 15% in Ontario. The rates of disparity are alarming. And if we're going to talk about education today, these are from Inspire. We're looking at 4 out of 10 on-reserve youth graduate grade 12 compared to 9 out of 10 non-Indigenous youth. 24% on reserve, and 87% of the national total reported high school graduation. Rates vary, but they are significantly less than the national average. So we have far fewer Indigenous people than we should have going into secondary education. Or post-secondary education. And then if you look further at the graduation rates from post-secondary among Indigenous students, the numbers get even slimmer and slimmer. And so this is the mess. This is the mess that Senator Marie Sinclair is talking about when we look at that quote and we think about what the legacy of Indian residential schools is. These statistics are it. And so the question is this what cultural genocide looks like? This is what they talk about at the end of the thing. Is that what we're in? And that's an important question, I think, to ask and to really think critically about, because I'm not sure even that the answer for this is necessarily yes. The question being, have we changed then? So have now the legacy residential schools, last one closed in 1997, 98, it's over. Are we now just healing? We're on the upswing of facing this hard past, and now we're getting through it. And that's what a lot of reconciliation conversations in Canada tend to look like, right? Is residential school was the big bad one that Canada is responsible for, and now we're healing, we're reconciling, we're on our way up. And I think that's important to be really critical about, to say who's saying that, where did that narrative come from, and how true is that when you actually look at the state of affairs in Canada today. So does anybody know where this photo is from? Yeah. So 7 Fallen Feathers by Tanya Talaga. How many people in here have read that book? Oh, that's really good. Tanya and I met a couple years back, I was working for Anishinaabe Aski Nation, and she had been making relationships in Thunder Bay with Nan for years to write this book. And I remember fangirling on Twitter. I had read Seven Fallen Feathers on the plane, sobbing a mess. And I was on Twitter, and I was like, I just love your book. You're amazing, like whatever. And she is still like the most amazing, humble, down-to-earth woman, and she messaged me back, this like national bestseller. I was mind blown. She's like, let's go for dinner, and we've been working together ever since, and have gone through the Massey lectures and all of these things, and she really has, what I admire most about her being from Thunder Bay is how much this book and how much her work actually changed the landscape of Thunder Bay, and it changed the social dialogue of what is happening in that city. This is not to say that I think that the racism and the violence in Thunder Bay has necessarily lessened in any sort of way, but it's now certainly undeniable thanks to her. It's not something that the city can pretend isn't happening. It's not something that the national media doesn't pay any attention to. And so Seven Fallen Feathers, for those of you who haven't read it, is about Thunder Bay. And more broadly, though, it's about Canada generally, because what's happening in the book in Seven Fallen Feathers happens all over Canada in every province and territory. And it's basically talking about how kids coming from remote communities like mine who don't have access to either high school or post-secondary educations are forced to leave their communities to access the right of an education, and they have to go to cities like Thunder Bay, where they're then, at 13 years old, by themselves, exposed to incredible violence in most of these cities, and suffer because of it. And so this book, Seven Fallen Feathers, is about 7 students who were in that circumstance and died while studying in Thunder Bay as young as 13 years old up to 20-some. And now, this was published in 2017, and now in 2019, almost 2020, we have 13 kids in Thunder Bay who have gone to school and died in that time. And it's like that, you know, as I was saying, in all sorts of different cities in Canada. And so if you look at that, the parallels to this, to what the reality is for kids now, is very striking, is it not, from when the residential school era was going on. Kids forced to leave their communities to get an education. They end up suffering, dying, being afflicted to violence because of it, denied rights that other people have the right to no matter what and are assured no matter what. And I think that that's something that when the government or when whoever is saying, well, residential schools is over and we're on this path to reconciliation now, we're fixing our things, are we though? How changed is the landscape of Canada really when you're looking at that? And then going forward, let's focus on education right now. Although you can find similarities between residential school era Canada in all sorts of things, in the prison industrial complex, in the healthcare system, and all these things. But looking at education today, turning to the post-secondary for a second. So I, a couple years back, was asked by Maclean's to write this article about what it's like for Indigenous students in post-secondary institutions, because as we mentioned earlier, you know, there's so many barriers for us to be able to even to get into those spaces, and then what barriers are we then facing in those spaces that make it harder to graduate? And so I came up with 4 kind of big stories or big things that I hear about often from Indigenous students, and wrote about it. And this is a quote from that article, and it's mentioning this. It said, education got us into this mess, and education will get us out. And while I do believe that to be true, it's hard to use education as a means to prosperity if the institutions providing the education aren't set up in a way that allows us to prosper. And so when I think about that, I think about my very first day at U of T. And I was living in student residence at the time. I was one of the only 2 self-identified Indigenous students at my college. And, you know, we had gone through orientation. They made this big thing about the land acknowledgement, about how equity and reconciliation is important. U of T had done actually their own TRC commission for the university specifically. And so they were really, you know, kind of trying to drive home this, this is a safe space for you. This is something that we want the university to be a reconciled academy and things like that. And so, but upon my first day, you know, I'm in orientation, and they're talking about how, you know, the rules of student housing, you can't hang anything up, put nails in the wall, you can't have friends over past a certain hour, and you're not allowed to light anything. you're not allowed to light a candle, you're not allowed to light incense, you're not allowed to whatever. And immediately something goes off in my brain. I'm like, oh, I have to be able to smudge. And so I go up to the coordinator and I said, hi, I'm an Indigenous student on campus. I understand I'm not allowed to light anything. I understand if I can't do it in my room because of fire or whatever, but I need to be provided a space where I can. So can you tell me where I can? And on the first day looked at me and said, well, I guess you can go outside to the park. And it was just so jarring, this like complete lack of, consistency in what they're saying to me about this is a space for you where we want you to thrive, where we're working so hard to create these mechanisms, and something so base as I can't even have medicines that I'm allowed to access and stuff in my own home, in the place that I'm supposed to be living and feeling safe and, all of these things. So this is a lot of what I think the reconciliation landscape looks like in universities, but all over Canada, is it's really willing to do the surface level, the fluffy, the land acknowledgements, put up a Christy Belcourt painting in an office or something like that. But the real fundamental changes, the things that cost money, are a little bit inconvenient, things like that, universities and institutions you'll find are, I've found at least, are far less willing to engage in that sort of reconciliation work. The other thing, from that time in that article I talked about, and another barrier that we see in institutions. I was at once a conference for Indigenous education in Saskatchewan, and there was this woman there, and we were chatting, and we got to talking about how she was going into journalism school, that she was a writer, and she wanted to write for major magazines. And so I said, oh, cool, where are you studying? And she said, well, I was going in between Ryerson and Carleton. They both have excellent journalism programs, but I ended up going with Carleton. And one of the other non-Indigenous participants there said, if you don't mind me asking, why did you turn down Ryerson? Their digital journalism program is exceptional. It's one of the best in the country. She said, how could I ever sit in a room named after Egerton Ryerson, the architect of the residential school system that put my whole family and my entire nation in the state that it is today? I absolutely could not sit there, and I could not learn that. And the integrity really struck me, but also the barrier, the very huge, massive barrier. And you'll see it not even, Ryerson's a perfect example. It's everywhere there. But U of T, you walk down the street, and you'll see a statue of John A. Macdonald sitting there. And I wonder what quote they use, and I bet you it's not kill the Indian and the child, And so there's this whole conversation to be had about even just the physical landscapes, not even just, the curricula and the, resources and the funding, just the physical institution itself. All of them have a lot of way to go in terms of decolonization or indigenization, if you want to call it that. The other things then we're looking at resources. How much resources are universities actually putting forward into Indigenous studies programs, into language programs? Indigenous studies is consistently one of the lowest funded programs in post-secondary institutions, and the main talking point for that being, well, fewer people take Indigenous studies. It's definitely less profitable for universities than other departments are. And so you'll find just way less resources allocated there. And it creates this sort of cyclical chicken and egg thing of how are you going to build the capacity of these programs if you're not going to put any money? How can you expect more kids to come when you don't have enough services already there for them? And what it really comes down to is they're not willing to take that small financial hit of these extremely rich institutions to be able to build up the capacity and to create more space for Indigenous people, because it doesn't make them immediate profit. And it's a little bit uncomfortable. And so, but still they're reconciling, right? And so, as Pamela Plummeter would say, it's never a reconciliation if it's comfortable. And this is something that universities have still yet to grasp. And so this is just this takeaway that I was talking about, that broadly speaking, we're only really willing to reconcile the academy so long as it isn't overly burdensome and it doesn't require fundamental and radical changes to the institution. And again, you will see that in all sorts of institutions, in the justice system. Nobody wants to be talking about restorative justice as opposed to punitive justice. Nobody wants to talk about how Canada spends more money fighting Indigenous people in courts over land claims and resource extraction than they do providing them services. These are things that people don't want to talk about. These are the changes that Canada is not willing to engage in and not willing to make. So, with all of that, fun, light, happy stuff in mind, then it's like, well, why should we care? Is a question I have been actually asked. And I think a lot of people, whether they ask me or not, I think are thinking it a lot of the time, non-Indigenous Canadians especially. Why should we care? And then a good follow-up question, what should we do? And when the question, why should we care, comes up, I want to go back to the video for a second where Senator Murray Sinclair said, Canada, you are guilty of committing cultural genocide. And it's something actually that in the time since he's made that quote, and in the time since then, that scholars have really picked apart to say that that's just untrue, that there is, by saying cultural genocide, you're implying that there's a hierarchy to genocide, that, that you can have, parts and like that full genocide would be worse, but cultural genocide bad, but that it's not as bad as full-blown genocide. And the fact being that genocide is genocide, and that when you kill a culture of a people, you are actively exterminating the people. And so it's something that we should really take out of context, and it's something that today we still see politicians in Canada using to justify this reconciliation for the colonizer, this surface-level reconciliation. With the release of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry in the report, we know that, based on those findings, that Canada is guilty of committing UN-defined genocide against Indigenous people, and it's not a past thing, it's a present thing. And so it's something to think about. Why should we care? We should care because we are living in a country that's committing genocide, because your peers, Indigenous peers, and these people in this country are both trying to resist this genocide and also actively trying to heal despite facing it every single day. And that weight is something that is unfathomable, I think, for a lot of people. It's something that no child in this country should have to go through. It's something no person ever should have to go through. And we all have a responsibility to the people here and to the future generations to lessen that burden in any way that we can. And I think why that's also a hard thing for a lot of Canadians to understand is because in the Western world especially, we've really adopted this mentality of individualism over collectivity. And so Canada is tremendously guilty of, as we've seen, committing atrocities in our own backyard. But at the same time, the reason why people don't seem to like to engage is because we've really lost this mentality that an injustice against any of us is an injustice against all of us. And so it's easy to divide and conquer us all in this way. And so when we're talking about what we can do, the most base level thing that we need to be doing is we need to be thinking with a more collective mindset. We need to be fostering greater empathy in ourselves and in the younger generations, because another thing they were talking about during the TRC is that, yes, policy changes are necessary. Yes, there needs to be reparations and money and land back and all of those things, but the only thing that will save this country, if we have a hope, is love. And so that's something that I really sit with most every day, especially on the day-to-day when you encounter somebody who's saying something, just egregious and horrible and violent. And that has carried me through a lot of bad days. And so also, when I say what can we do, I have to admit that is one of my absolute least favorite questions that I get after a thing is when, you give this presentation, they come up and they're like, well, what can I do personally? And I know that it comes from the best intended of places, but I think that that's a very personal question that when people ask me that, I often say like, well, I don't know you. What are your capacities? What's your time like? How dedicated are you to this? What's your financial situation? Because, you could be giving money. That is a reparation. That's another thing in Canada. People like to talk about reconciliation. They never really like to talk about reparations. You'll notice that. And so, but broadly speaking, I want to give at least a short list of things that I think everybody can take away and things that everybody can do now that I hope we've come to a greater place of caring. And so for just reading resources, the TRC, of course, being one, and especially in post-secondary institutions, I put the TRC and I also should have put the inquiry, the report from Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, because both of those have calls to action for everybody at an institutional level, at an individual level, especially the MMIWG report has Canadian-specific recommendations. And I think what's really important about that one as well is it talks about how, even though it really defines out also that this is a Canadian responsibility. And so I think what I like about that, and then turning back as well to that main quote, education got us into this mess, and it'll be education that gets us out of this mess. I believe as well that it's not necessarily Indigenous people getting degrees that is going to be getting us out of this mess. It's Canadians coming to a greater education as well that really does a lot of that legwork. Not to say that increased graduation rates and education attainment rates for Indigenous people is not important, but the people who need the most educating in a very formal sense that we think about are the non-Indigenous people. The educational work that Indigenous people are doing is we're doing it every day. We're actively trying to relearn our languages, to relearn our cultures and our histories and our lineage. And that work already, while not formalized, is a double burden from what we have to do. So the very least that the rest of us can be doing is learning this sort of thing, coming out and showing up. So Decolonizing Education by Mary Batiste is also a great resource. Indigenous Rights by Chelsea Vowell is one I go, and she is amazing, fire. Follow her on Twitter. She takes no BS, and I love that about her. The other thing being provide resources. And so this is what I was talking about as well. The thing nobody wants to talk about. Everybody wants to know what book they can read. They want to know what YouTube video they can watch or whatever song you can listen to. Nobody wants to talk about land back, which is kind of a meme in Indigenous communities, but is true, is that there is no real meaningful conversation without land. That there's no real meaningful conversation without talking about the uncomfortable truth of we have to give things up. And Indigenous people have been doing a lot of giving up over the past bit of time. And this is not to say taking and living in this divided and sort of segregated Canada at all, but that there is reparation work to be doing. And something I turn to when I think about this, I look at Unistoten and Wet'suwet'en, and when they were talking about their land that was still actively trying to be taken from them, trying to be colonized this year. And what they were saying is, you don't realize is we're not keeping this for ourselves and for our community, and that would be a justified reason for them too. But what they were doing and what they said was, we are doing this for you and for your kids and for your future generations as well. We're doing this for all of us. So when we talk about reparations, as much as it goes back to Indigenous people and it goes back into their hands, what they're really doing this is for all of us. It's a kind of known fact in the environmental community that Indigenous people only have autonomy over 8% of the world's land, but they protect 90% of the world's biodiversity. And in this UN report that came out just earlier this year, they were talking about how in 10 years' time, we're looking at missing at least 1 million different types of species. Just like devastating, profound losses at scales I can't even really think about. But that our greatest hope lies in Indigenous communities. They didn't say this, but you look at the statistics where those areas that Indigenous people still maintain their sovereignty and control over, where the rest of the world sees depleting numbers of biodiversity and of ecological security, it's increasing in some areas in Indigenous places. And so this is another example of why we're doing this. It's not just to give it back to Indigenous people because it's right, because we stole it, because it's whatever, but because it's for all of us. It benefits all of us. And so that's something to think about and to keep in mind, that there are, I'm saying land back, but there are also a number of charities of, sponsor Indigenous students who have some of the highest child poverty rates and need to access services and education and, things like that. Again, we talked about this, develop greater empathy and gratitude for the Indigenous people in your life, build those relationships. And the academy is something I think about as well, and another barrier is, when the Colton Boushie and Tina Fontaine murders happened. And for my community, at least in Toronto, it was really shocking. Like, it was really so painful because, when you survive a genocide, anybody that's left is family. And so it was it was like, it could have been my brother, it could have been my uncle, it could have been any of those things. And so we had to go through this huge collective grieving process. And the university was not willing to give us the amount of time to leave to protest, to go home, to talk to our family, to do all these things. But you'll see that these are the same institutions that are super willing to put you on a poster for Indigenous studies in front of, you know, the university and retweet your things on Twitter when you do something that makes them look good. And so this is like the fallacy in these institutions and the places where you're like, that's just blatant lack of empathy. That's just a blatant lack of gratitude that you were even still maintain the strength to be here, that you give us your knowledge and your presence and your time and your space. Another thing I think about in poli-sci, my first year, this was a hard class, and it's something that I think a lot of Indigenous students will empathize with. Most people that I know, my friends, my colleagues, will say they've had an experience like this, where we were talking about, you know, it was poli-sci. We had 1 week where we're talking about Indigenous politics in Canada, the thematic week. And we, you know, it's like we're going to do residential schools, the Indian Act, all of it in just 2 hours, go. And so these people from these students who have just like no knowledge, I think, should not be engaging necessarily in the way that we are with the structures that we're being given with such a sensitive topic, and just kind of given this free-for-all, and have also be told that a lot of these things are up for debate, which is the way that a lot of university settings work, right? Is that you can debate ideas, and this is a place for free speech, but the thing is that it always comes down to free speech of somebody saying something violent always takes precedent over the safety and security of the marginalized people in that room. And so that's what it ends up being for Indigenous students in that space. And I remember this one guy went off on this huge rant about how, you know, he thought that Indigenous people were lazy. We blow this out of proportion. If we had just been more compliant with things like residential school and the Indian Act, then we wouldn't be in the state that we're in now. And this is what I'm saying, is that everybody else in this room didn't have the knowledge or the courage or whatever it was to be able to say anything to that guy. And then it turns to myself, status Indian, granddaughter of 2 residential school survivors, and it's my job to say something. And if I say anything, it's not be gracious for this learning that I'm giving you now. It's not I'm going to get an apology. It's now I'm entering a debate. I'm entering a debate where I know I'm going to lose. I know I'm going to lose because he doesn't have the emotional stakes that I do in this, that the university and that TA is not there to protect me in this case. And I'm already entering to this in a place where I feel truly unsafe. And so this is a story that is so common, and even worse for a lot of Indigenous people in different places. And so this is something where we as other people in that room, as educators, as whoever, need to think about how can I create a safer space? How can I take that burden off of that child's hands and always be in a position of empathy and looking through the eyes of others? And then the other one being, the last one I will say on what can we do is practice accomplicehood outside of the school walls. And that means things like show up with your vote, show up with your money, vote as if you were an Indigenous person and your life was at stake at the ballot, because it is. And so I know voting is a complex conversation also in Indigenous communities. There's a lot to talk about with sovereignty and treaty and, you know, the history of violence and oppression by the government. But for non-Indigenous people especially, I think we, as in privileged positions in this country, no matter what government gets in, yeah, it sucks, but the quality of life that we experience, you know, doesn't drastically change. But who does suffer profoundly at the hands of regressive policies are those people at the very bottom, oftentimes Indigenous people, the most marginalized. And if we don't have those people in mind when we show up to the ballots, we are not practicing accomplicehood outside of the classroom. And so those are some things I just wanted to give as tangible ways forward. And I don't want to end this on a note of, you know, like, oh, there's so much to do. Today is a day of honor, and it's a day of celebration, and it's a day to pay respect and homage to, you know, all of our ancestors that came before us and all of the Indigenous folks carrying that burden every single day, and a day to honor them. And I think especially here, to acknowledge the people working within the academy, working within the institutions, Indigenous folks, to try and make those changes that we just talked about. And so I wanted to play this as a way to end it off. to pay honor. It's a Mi'kmaq song sung by a man named Jeremy Dutcher, who's incredible. Yeah, after that, we could have a 5-minute break or something like that, and if anybody had any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them, or if there's no questions, we can end there depending on how the room goes. But I hope you'll all join me in kind of taking the 3 minutes or whatever it is for this to pay honor to those folks.
Be it therefore resolved at a duly convened council meeting in Elsipogtog, let it be known to all that we, as the chief and council of Elsipogtog, are reclaiming all unoccupied reserve lands.
Gitchi McGretch. Yeah, give him five minutes to stretch or whatever you need to do. I think it's so funny that those for this game. Sounds like a fun game to play. Yeah.
I spent the entire summer with my grandmother, and I got so picky on topics with her. I'd be like, they're gonna lose. They're gonna lose.
I had a game showcase.
Oh my
All,
god.
all that I watched.
Have you seen any of like the video Olympics? Oh yeah. Game time. It's television.
All right.
Yeah, if I had a monstrosity or
Okie
something
doke.
right beside me. Robotics gonna be used.
I don't know how I don't do the teacher thing. I'm like feel like I'm like corralling. But hello everyone. Welcome back. I guess now would be the time for questions, if anybody has any, or discussion, or just reflection also from the presentation. I know it's sometimes like and today just generally is like a very emotionally laborious one. So if anyone has anything they want to bring up, yeah, Kayla is here with a microphone. So she will talk show host, run it to you, do it.
Thank you so much for this morning. I really appreciate it. My question is about the beginnings in institutions like ours. We're having conversations about indigenization and decolonization, decolonizing the classrooms. And from your lens, I'd like to hear a little bit about your perspective on that and what insights you might have around that.
Right. Thank you. I think first off, it's always a hard conversation to have about decolonization in colonial institutions. It's always begs the question of, you know, can you decolonize something that is colonial, that is at its core fundamentally colonial, or is it something that you kind of have to be willing to look at from zero and build something anew that is truly decolonized? That's a conversation that is having. And then the question around indigenization. I mean, in institutions, the things I always say that you can look at first, of course, is then just the physical space. The physical space of the things that I was mentioning earlier, and that alone provides students with a level of safety and security that they wouldn't have otherwise had, whether or not that they know it. But I think when we talk about post-secondary, and this is me getting into like a really, really rad teachings I have from some elders, but they said, you know, in a decolonized version of education, for us, people would not be paying for knowledge. And so it's talking about, again, this free tuition conversation that students are already having that they implicitly know, which I think is something also really interesting, is that education should be free. Another thing to talk about is the resources that universities have, and about how a lot of universities, post-secondary institutions, colleges, like to hoard a lot of wealth and hoard a lot of knowledge. And so things like even libraries. Does anybody know Erica Violet Lee? She's an amazing Indigenous rights activist. She used to go to U of T, she's in Saskatchewan, but she has this really great blog post about this, about how universities and post-secondary institutions and colleges have collected the most valuable resources that we have in the form of books, ebooks, you know, like just the voices of our people as well, like the Indigenous Scholars Library grows at post-secondary institutions all the time. But the people in the community who need those the most, the people who aren't actually in the institutions, the populations on the streets, those are the people who need that and that we don't give them access to. And that is also not what a decolonial institution would look like. And so I think that there's also lobbying to be done at an administrative level, which I know is like probably preaching to the choir and like the hardest, most, you know, labor-intensive thing spiritually even ever. But it's true. And I think also in the classroom, how we validate forms of knowing and forms of learning is like another big one. Something that I always thought was really good, one of my colleagues who is a TA, Indigenous Studies, he said, do you know how the grading system came about? Because the universities as we know them now and stuff like that happened, and this is applicable to all post-secondary, but started in England in like the whatever, you know, century. And it was free also to go, it wasn't free to go to university, but only the uber rich could go, and they had no grading system. at that point, because it was just like you pay to get in, to learn, and to be smart and the best. And then when they opened it up to all folks to be able to go, and more low-income people to go, that's actually when the grading system was introduced, because they still needed a way to differentiate between the rich and the poor and segregate them and class section them and stuff like that, so that you know, you could, because there was this question of like, how am I supposed to be special and different and better if I'm in the same place as lower class people? And again, so grades, by the very notion of them, are super colonial, are super ways to segregate and make others, and, you know, do this sort of thing. And so there's a whole paradigm shift about the way that the classroom works, how we evaluate people, things like that. But those are just things off of the top of my head that I think about. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. Anybody else?
First and foremost, I just want to say thank you for coming here. And most people are aware of the 60 Scoop here today. And currently in Canada, there's kind of a 60 Scoop that's going on today. In 2016, Canada released a study saying that despite only being 8% of the population, 52% of kids in foster care are Indigenous. I just want to hear some of your thoughts and opinions on that issue and how that could be resolved moving forward.
Yeah, resolved is a big one, I suppose. But it is the question also of, the millennial scoop, I believe, is what they're calling it nowadays. But that it is just, again, this replication of residential school in a way in the 21st century, with a new name and a new brand and a new title, and just a different Indian agent. And so when I talk to people, I don't have as much knowledge in child welfare as I do in other areas, but when I talk to people in my community who do, the things that they talk about, of course, go back to self-determination and sovereignty, and it goes back to the community having their own autonomy and jurisdiction and control over how child welfare services work in the community. And then there's also, and so that's, you know, huge policy changes. It's a huge relinquishment of power on the part of the government, and something that we've still yet to see they're not willing to engage with. And I don't know anything super much about this, but if anybody does, I know in BC, they just, the other month or something, came up with this provincial-wide policy change where they're no longer allowed, I believe, to take children right out of the hospital. Type of thing, because there was the case that blew up from APTN just a couple months back about, you know, this child that had been born, had literally, you know, been alive for a couple seconds in this world, and was already taken for like just no reason other than it's part of the government's big plan. And so they created, the court ruled that it was unjust, and that they came down with this provincial order that should be changing that in the landscape of BC, but I don't know necessarily what that looks like or where the other provinces stand in terms of that processes. So those are things as well. But then also I think it's this conversation about community healing, because the way that, you know, we are all still intergenerationally trying to heal from the traumas of the past, and it's those sort of, you know, that process of healing that the government and that, what's it called, like child welfare agents deem us as unfit for those reasons. And so I think that there has to be conversations around collective healing, around restorative justice, around the way that we warrant what a good parent is, and in the way that my community, at least in Anishinaabe, we arranged our child services is that it was raised by the entire community. But when, you know, a colonial Western perspective comes in and looks at this kid that's going around and running around the community and, you know, is like spends so much time with their grandparents or their aunts as opposed to their primary caregivers and stuff like that, it starts to, in this paradigm and this worldview, look like neglect, or look like it's just, you know, not this nuclear way that we conceptualize families as being. So there's that element of stuff going on as well. It's a very multi-layer one. I probably could make a whole other presentation about it, but thank you.
To add on that, it's like all the thoughts and sayings from colonial times, talking towards First Nations communities who are like that. It's amazing how much it's grasped on to the community as well, between each other.
Like in terms of like the lateral violence and stuff like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, that's a huge conversation that we need to be having more of in the community itself, right? It's one of our, and also, I mean, I think a product, at least, of internalized colonialism, right? That's divide and conquer from the inside out. And so, yeah, but it's super destructive to how we run and operate ourselves and all those things and heal.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. It's a great point. There's something I was thinking about just a second ago. No, I can't remember. Did anybody else have anything? Will I try and remember? Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming and sitting so amazingly and sharing your energy and being a part of this with me. I hope you guys have a really reflective day and that the rest of the week and the year treats you well. Niawan, miigwech. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. I hope that you reflect on this for the rest of the day and every other day thereafter to make my job a little easier. Wink, wink. But honestly, have a great day. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see all of the orange, and we did film this session, so it's going to be made available after if there's ever something you want to look back on. Miigwech.